We're here today with David von Spreckelsen, Division President of Toll Brothers City Living. Thank you, David, for joining us.
Thank you.
You joined Toll Brothers in 2004. What has changed at Toll Brothers since then? How has the strategy evolved?
We're a large, publicly traded, predominantly single-family home builder up until that point. So we entered the market after having a little bit of success on the other side of the Hudson River in Hoboken, where we were involved in a couple of large projects. And Bob Toll, having a place in New York for years and years, loving New York, said, why don't we just come right across the river? And so we did that. They hired me to find property and then figure out how to develop those properties. So I was working at a small development firm at the time, and I was in tune to what was going on in the residential market, and I was watching various rezonings that were going through. That's sort of the initial focus, and we did projects in Long Island City right after the Hunters Point rezoning, and in Williamsburg. We did 3 buildings there right after the rezoning went through on the north side. After that, we had a chance to, really evaluate the market once we were going and pick and choose other locations. One of the things that we faced was a lot of competition, because when these rezonings went through, a lot of people jumped in and built at the same time. So I think one change that we've done since then is we've been focusing more on areas of the city that are supply constrained.
Just focusing on like a more boutique project, how though that strategy is basically market driven, so that you just improve your chances of being successful, like quickly getting in, selling, moving on.
Yeah, I think when you have a larger building with, say, hundreds of units, it's going to take a while to sell out, and during that period of time, you don't know what changes might occur in the market. So you might go through a cycle or even 2 cycles, who knows. From when you break ground to when you're finished with a project like that, it could be 4 or 5 years. There's more things that can be disruptive. But if you're fewer number of units, you get in and get out, shorter period of time, and hopefully, prices stick and everything goes well.
Right. I mean, I know over the past 2 years, I guess we've seen you guys do just different, broker incentives or concessions, and it's been really impressive to see just a range of options and a lot of creativity coming from you, from the company, in terms of what does it take to move these units.
Mm-hmm. But the goal is to try to keep the price, but if you can't, that's an adjustment that you can make as well. And I think, we have a certain flexibility that others may not with regard to pricing, because we're generally a low-cost provider. We do so much in-house. So we build open shop in-house. We sell ourselves. We have low-cost financing, and many of the projects we do 100% cash. So if there needs to be flexibility with regard to pricing, we're able to do that and not to get hurt by it.
Do you think that being a public company has put you in the position where you have the cash to do that, or where that's been able to influence your decisions and run things the way you want, as opposed to being private and relying on the debt and equity markets more?
Yeah, we have had that flexibility, and it was most pronounced when we were coming out of the downturn. And generally, people weren't able to get loans to do condo developments. And we were, at that point, we weren't leveraging at all. We weren't taking outside equity. It was all cash. And so we were not relying on anybody at all. And we made great purchases in 2010, 2011, 2012. We picked things out of bankruptcy. We made deals on sites that were distressed. And we had some of our most successful projects then, because of the cycle and how long it takes to get product to market. By the time we were selling those sites that we bought at good numbers, the market had started to rebound. And so we were hitting a market where there was virtually no competition. And we were, those were good old days. We were raising prices every couple of weeks. But
things have changed a little.
Yeah, they changed. We'll get there again, maybe.
How did you get to Toll, actually?
went to business school. I worked briefly in management consulting after business school in the retail industry. Didn't love it. Decided to go back to school, and I got a master's in urban planning. And so both the MBA and the MUP were 2-year degrees, full-time. So another 4 years. So I've always liked, the written word and marketing. So after that, I decided to go to planning school. I went to Hunter for the urban planning degree. I went into city government. I worked at EDC. And that was the biggest influence, because when I was there, and I went there because I loved the city. I wanted to do something that would benefit the city. So while at EDC, I worked with a lot of developers. Our goal was to convey properties, either leasing or selling them to developers so they would be developed. They would bring in jobs and tax revenue. When I was there for about 4 years, and coming out, I wanted to go in the private sector. I didn't want to stay in government forever and be labeled a government civil service person or anything like that.
So for your early acquisitions at Toll, do you think that you were, you mentioned that you were focused on areas that were being rezoned and whatnot, so it was heavily influenced by your EDC experience and just what you knew from there, right?
Yeah, definitely. Because when I was at EDC, I was the one sending out RFPs, based on rezonings and things like that. So I knew the government process pretty well, and I just kept tabs on what was going on in those locations. And they were often very primed for condo, which is all, we have a separate rental division that I'm not necessarily involved with. So I knew I was going to be doing for sale product, and some of these areas were being rezoned, I think with that in mind, that they already had the infrastructure necessary to support home ownership, and so we jumped in on that.
One of the first contracts that you signed was in Gowanus, though, which later was designated a Superfund site. And I'm curious about your thoughts. I think at the time you said it would be many, many years until development could pick up again.
Yeah, so it was three sites on the canal that were contiguous, and so we're going to do 2 city blocks, but not zoned. So we had to rezone them. Really proud of the accomplishment. But within a month of our getting it rezoned, the feds came in and said, we're going to look at this for a Superfund site. And I didn't even know exactly what that meant. And I knew that there was some contamination of properties. And I thought, wow, Superfund, money, this is perfect. But I found that, they don't have money in the Superfund. What they do is they go to the property owners who had contributed to the degradation or contamination, and they try to get money from them, and those property owners fight it, and so then they sue them, and so it's a really, really long process. And when we were literally at the celebration dinner for the rezoning, when my consultants told me they're looking at a Superfund, and it was it became like a wake then. It was bleak. When we figured out, I started reading up on it, and I saw that other waterways that had this kind of a designation where you had multiple property owners along the water, and it was complicated, that it could take 20 years before the cleanup was even commenced. So I anticipated a long road, and it's now, that was 2000, I guess 8 or 9. So it's 10 years, and the cleanup is just starting, and the rezonings have been put on hold, so there's nothing happening there. The only development that's occurred are on the properties that we rezoned. So had we not finished that, there would be no change there. And what happened was, because we were condo people, we felt that it would be really hard to sell units on the canal when it has this designation. Perhaps, condo buyers wouldn't even be able to get end loans. Like banks would say, I'm not going to make a loan. And also we thought, we could be in the cleanup could commence, and there could be guys walking around in white suits when we open our sales office, and it would just turn people off. So we decided to pull out. Subsequently, those 3 property owners sold to Lightstone, and Lightstone with the intention of doing a rental project there. So, like I said, we now have this rental division. If we had it back then, maybe we would have gone forward that way because we had a very low basis. But yeah, that's a bummer. I live very close to the canal too, so I would love to have seen that development happen.
Do you put that in the regret category, or do you take kind of a more meta approach? Like, look, sometimes there's just a situation, and the best move is to walk away.
I advocated for keeping that because in doing an analysis of the properties, even if the cleanup were to have taken 20 years and we were going to wait that long, it still made sense.
What is the relationship between what you're doing here and kind of the home office in Pennsylvania? Being a public company, but you obviously run a division here, so.
Yeah, they, Toll has been really great and given me a lot of autonomy from day one. And the guy who was my boss early on has subsequently become president, not CEO, but president. So I interact less with him, and there's a head of city living, all of city living, who's in New Jersey, and so he's my main point of contact. And I would say that early on, I had even more autonomy because, one, no one else at Toll really knew anything about the urban game, so nobody really bothered me that much. And my boss was in Pennsylvania, so
right.
I just
And you had your laptop.
Right, I had my laptop. When he was going to come to town, I would put a suit on, whatever it took. But now that now that we've gotten going as a division, and we've got stuff in New Jersey and outside of DC, and we're looking at some other new markets, senior management knows the urban game better, so they're more interested now. So they have more opinions about things that they didn't early on. So, but still given a lot of autonomy, and it's been great. And I think that's the only way it would have worked. If they had really tried to control early on and run it from either a single family mentality or a suburban mentality, I don't think it would have worked as well. And I can say that of the other national home builders, no one else has really gotten into our markets on the condo side. And there was a time when Pulte had a site in the Bronx, but they didn't go forward with it. And Hovnanian had a site which was almost across the street from my office in downtown Brooklyn early on Livingston Street, and then they didn't go through. And I think they never had boots on the ground, and so they were trying to do it from afar, and they didn't really get it.
So 2 years ago, when Toll CEO Doug Yearley went on the conference call and said, we're taking a slight step back from, we're not in ultra luxury. We're going to be in that more moderate luxury category, very strategic, seemingly a good move. Was that something that you were involved in and said, like, look, this is what the market is doing here with my boots on the ground, I can tell you? Or is it like, they look at the dollars and cents of it all? And...
Well, that's part of it too, but I think that we were never really in the ultra luxury. Right. We didn't do Billionaires Row. I was always afraid of that because just thinking that there are fewer buyers at that level, and the cost and the stakes are really, really high. And if you're in that market, things could go wrong at a bigger level than in something where you're looking at something that's more modest, more moderate.
Talk to me a little bit about the marketing strategy. So do you do all the marketing in-house for everything? I know in Park you've also worked with outside brokers and designers. So just generally, do you start with things in-house?
Well, when we first started back in 2004, not knowing the market,
right.
I thought that we should use outside brokers to sell our units, and those brokers recommended marketing companies who we worked with to do those early projects, and we consequently learned a lot, and so we saw who was operating in the market and in terms of marketing and who would be good to hire, when we're doing it on our own without an outside broker. We also hired some brokers from the various companies that we interfaced with or worked with. So we had agents from Corcoran and Halstead and Element and stuff like that. We've done a mix of some projects where we think we know the market very well, we know the buyer very well, and we're capable of addressing that all in-house. We've done 100% in-house, and that's our marketing department in Horsham, Pennsylvania, as well as we have a couple people who are up in New York. But really, it's mostly all happening in Horsham. When we've got a product that's a little different, that we might think is a little more far afield from what Horsham is used to, we will augment their team with some consultants in New York, and an ad agency or a marketing firm. We have the capacity to do all the renderings in-house in Horsham, but often we'll pick a renderer who's up here, or someone who's got more experience doing urban high-rise product.
How many active projects do you have now?
So we have, like right now, I would say 7.
Where do you see, when you kind of take the step back from Manhattan and you look at city living generally, where's the most traction now in terms of just like the volume of deals and where are things moving?
Well, we've always had really, really good fortune in Hoboken, and now more recently in Jersey City. And in Hoboken, it was because we had all of the best properties on the waterfront. Hudson T is a project that's 4 or 5 buildings, and Maxwell Place, same thing. More recently, we got into Jersey City, and we're finding almost as much demand there as in Hoboken. So those have been just really super successful markets for us. New York still is, obviously, and now we're looking at possibilities on the West Coast. We've looked at other markets on the East Coast as well, and when we find the right site, we're definitely primed to jump on it.
What is the right site? How do you define that, or how can you define it for us?
I think so. What I was saying before with supply-constrained areas, so something in a market that is mature enough that it's going to be able to sustain home ownership. I'm at conferences lots of times and on panels, and everyone wants to talk about where's the new market, what's latest, and I don't know, because we're not looking at that. Because
you don't have a crystal ball.
I don't have a crystal ball, but also you take a big risk if you're doing home ownership and you go into something that's not yet established. So those areas are really for the guys who do rental. And after years of rental buildings operating, you get the infrastructure that can sustain home ownership, then you go in and do it. And I think we also learned from Northside Piers. I thought I moved into Dumbo on the first building that David Walentis did in 1998, and I didn't think that was really pioneering, and I thought it was a no-brainer to buy in that building. So when we did Northside Piers in Williamsburg after the rezoning, I thought, people are going to be knocking down the door to get in here. And it did go pretty well, but we did have people come to the sales office and say, it's kind of far from the subway, and there is no supermarket, and there are not enough restaurants. So I wouldn't make that mistake again. I would want to make sure that when people are looking to buy in one of our buildings, they know that not only is it well amenitized within the building, but the neighborhood has everything too.
Keeping that in mind, would you look in the Bronx, for example, where rezoning is a big part of the
conversation?
conversation?
Yeah, I think it's not yet ready for pure market rate condo. But in the next few years, possibly, yes. I mean, we do monitor it, but we're not about to jump in there.
I wanted to ask about the building in Hudson Square. Tell me just a little bit about kind of what price point you're coming out with in the fall.
So it's a pretty big project. It's a through-block site, so it's 2 buildings. It's one building on King Street and one on Charlton. The main lobby will be on Charlton. It's going to be called 77 Charlton, very creative name. And it's about 160 units. So,
I mean, we've been talking about kind of this shift towards smaller projects and smaller sites, but I'm assuming this is, you bought it.
We bought it in 2012. Right. And, the buildings end up getting more, I mean, it was going to be big to begin with, but it's even more units than we anticipated because we're doing smaller units. And that's really, reflects where the market is today. So we're skewing the developments away from the bigger units to the more efficient units, the small units, so we can keep as much of the product in a building say below $2 million, below $3 million, because what's on the market right now is a lot of what's $2.5 million and up, and either people who were interested in that already bought, or they're waiting on the sidelines to see what happens because they see a lot of it out there. So with Charlton, it's 160 units. Probably when we did the original pro forma, it was closer to maybe 100 units. And we're targeting right about 2,000 a foot, which we see as, for a while there, that was almost the minimum in New York. Like, you're going to get 2,000 a foot no matter what you do. That's not the case anymore with the inventory that's on the market and with buyers being price sensitive. And finally, you need to be priced right or your product is going to sit on the market.
Right. Does that aversion to risk come from the tolls themselves, or is it just built into being a large public company?
I don't know exactly. I mean, I think part of it is me. I'm always cautious with things. So I've always thought middle of the road, be safe. And probably, that's kind of the thinking at Toll Brothers too. Although if you look at what we do in the single family world, we have always been at a much higher price point than the other national home builders. So we compete in local markets with custom home builders, super high end. So I don't know if it's still the case, but for years and years, we were basically twice the price of the other national home builders.
Which part of your job do you like the most?
I like the early part of the job where you're doing the acquisition because it's fun, it's challenging, it's really competitive. And then when you're figuring out what you can build on the site, it's fun working with the architects, and then designing the building I like a lot. When you're doing development in New York City, you're doing a building that's going to be part of the landscape. It's going to last a really long time. I care a lot about that, and I get involved in that a lot. And those are also the periods where just everything is great because you're buying, you're designing, it's like nothing's gone wrong yet, and then things, happen, and you might be behind in construction or the market might level off or whatever. So the early part's the fun part.
Is it frustrating, the second part, where you're just waiting for it to be done? And real estate and development in New York is like a sport. Everyone's watching. How are they doing? How are you doing?
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's.
How do you stay? How can you be patient to wait so many years?
It's not. It's still interesting to see something get built and something to come into its presence in the city. Sometimes it takes a little longer than you want, and what I do is I don't go by the site real super regularly because I want to see progress in between times that I go. And we also have different buildings in different stages, so I can still be working on the design part while we're wrapping up other parts. But yeah, you do get to the point where it's like, I just, I want to be finished. I want to sell these. I want to move on to the next building. It does happen.
All right. Well, thank you so much for doing this with us today. It was good talking to you.
Yep. Thanks for having me.